Welcome to Module 8, the history of social class and income inequality. And so in this module, we'll delve more into the early 20th century leading up to the Great Depression and some of the movements to reform the problems with the working class, get better conditions, bring more income to people, this type of thing. And so the period of the early 20th century is known as the Progressive Era. And the idea behind this is that there were all these different reformers wanting to make a variety of changes. Progressives saw industrialization and urbanization as potentially disruptive forces, that there were all of these problems, a long list of them that the Industrial Revolution and urbanization had caused, this income gap that had developed. And they believed that you could use government to try to change society for the better. Now, this was never a solid movement. The progressives were all a whole bunch of different individuals and groups that wanted different things, and sometimes they would overlap. And they wanted to bring private economic power under public control. They felt that there was too many monopolies, that these big corporations and industrial capitalists were out of control. And so many progressives were antitrust, anti-monopoly, trying to rein in what they saw as the excesses of capitalism. They wanted to regulate railroads and other industries, especially utilities. Now, not all progressives were socialists, not even close, but many were socialists that wanted to, or had socialist leanings, and they wanted to regulate railroads, get these industries more under control so that they wouldn't start taking advantage of people and gouging people. As we saw in the last module, there are very few regulations, there are very few laws in dealing with these types of corporations. And so some of these individuals that I wanted to mention and their groups, and the first would be Ida Tarbell. And so she would campaign against corruption in politics and business. She was what was known as a muckraker, the idea being an investigative reporter who goes out there and digs up the dirt and makes it public. And so she took on John D. Rockefeller, who we had talked about before in the last module. And so her articles would appear in McClure's magazine between November of 1902 and October of 1904, and she would start pointing out the corruption of his businesses, the domination that he had in government and politics. The material was eventually published as a book, History of the Standard Oil Company, in 1904. Now, Jane Addams would be another one of these progressive reformers, and probably one of the better known ones, and she was looking not at corporate reform like Ida Tarbell was, but at social reform. And in 1889, she would establish Hull House in Chicago. And this was a settlement house where that workers and others, low-income people living in poverty, could come to get a better education, get more skills and training, get aid and help. And this was one of the first of what would be known as settlement houses. She also helped found the National Progressive Party in 1912. And what she was really promoting with these settlement houses was that there was no way that the working class and the poor in the United States could ever get a leg up because they lacked opportunity, they lacked education and skills. And so she would provide this with these settlement houses. There would be classes, especially night classes, because people had to work during the day. These settlement houses provided child care so that kids would not have to be running around because both mothers and fathers worked, or single mothers had to work, and then there would be school for these children as well. She would also found the Women's Peace Party in 1915. She was promoting for peace as World War I would be breaking out, and she would become very anti-war, and many progressives were anti-World War I and anti-war. She would be elected in 1915 as president of the International Congress of Women, and so she was working on suffrage issues as well as her Peace Party issues. Now, all of these progressives, they wanted many different issues as they move into the early 20th century, and one of these would be the direct election of U.S. senators. Before this period, U.S. senators were not directly elected by the people, that they would be appointed by state legislatures. And so the idea was this gave more control into the hands of the population. They wanted to create an initiative, referendum, and recall process so that you could initiate possible laws or change things, that you could recall politicians, and they wanted women's suffrage. They also wanted workers' rights. Many progressives were worker reformers, labor reformers, and so they wanted workers' compensation programs. They wanted women's hours and wages, their women's hours to be lowered, so that because this is still a male-dominated society and women had to take care of the kids as well as work 12, 14-hour days, and so they wanted to lower that down, while at the same time raising women's wages, because women were only getting 30 to 40 cents on the dollar of men. They wanted to restrict child labor, and they wanted child labor laws, and we had talked about this before with the Industrial Revolution. They wanted improved working conditions, so they wanted more safety measures, more cleanliness, to stop accidents. And then if there were accidents, they wanted this workers' compensation so that if you are injured on the job, you have some recourse. And so the labor movement is what we're really going to focus on. There were other reform movements of the progressives looking at to end prostitution, temperance, to end drinking, cleaning up the city with sanitation movements, a whole host of progressive movements. But we're focusing on the labor movement because this ties into directly income inequality. And one of the big unions that would be founded in the early 20th century that would make a name for itself would be the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW. And it was founded in June of 1905. And it was founded out of a convention of socialists, anarchists, and radical trade unionists who were very, very unhappy with the current unions that were there and opposed to the policies of the AFL that we talked about last module, because they did not include women, unskilled labor, immigrants, and they wanted to open it up more. And so this organization, the IWW, would be, or what would become known as the Wobblies, would be founded by four individuals: William Big Bill Haywood, Daniel De Leon, Lucy Parsons, who is an African-American woman, and Mary Harris Mother Jones. And Mother Jones was named this because she had worked a lot with mine workers and striking workers. And so as strikers would go, workers would go on strike, they could no longer have any money coming in. And so what Mother Jones did is she nursed them, she provided food for them. If they were sick, she took care of them. All of these kinds of things. And so they ended up calling her Mother Jones, as she was the mother of all of them. So these four individuals, who were considered radical in their day, would form the IWW that was open to anybody. These unions would be open to any group, whatever racial group, women, anybody that wanted to organize. And so they welcomed women, foreigners, African Americans, immigrants, everybody. The IWW would be condemned by politicians and the press as being radical, violent, out of control. Basically, they were not all that violent, most of them themselves, but they also did not take violence. And so if strike breakers would come in to try to intimidate workers, the IWW would fight back tooth and nail. And so there would be a lot of clashes between companies and their individuals that they brought in to break up strikes and the IWW. Factory owners would employ both nonviolent and violent methods to disrupt their meetings and try to get rid of them. And nonviolent methods would include sending in the Salvation Army bands. In the past, you would see a lot more Salvation Army bands than you do today, but they would set up right when an IWW speaker was talking right nearby and play as loudly as they could to drown out speakers. And then, of course, factory owners would send in strike breakers who were armed with clubs, knives, guns, in order to disrupt their meetings as well for violent methods. Now, members of the IWW or Wobblies were often arrested and sometimes killed for making public speeches. They would become heavily involved with the Goldfield strike in Nevada in 1906 of helping mine workers, and the Press Steel Car Company, which was a railroad strike in 1909. And the Wobblies were instrumental in supporting it, bringing in more people to help them, these types of things. And so they were not a favorite of corporate owners in the United States. Now, in 1909, they would make a very public stand on free speech. And this would happen in Spokane, Washington, very near where we are. And so Spokane, in order to try to stop the IWW from doing their talks and recruitments, would outlaw any kind of street meetings. And what they meant by this is if an individual started talking on a street corner to people or at a plaza and a few people would gather, that would be deemed as a street meeting. And so really all you could have is 3 or more people talking on the street, and they could arrest you for it. And the idea would be to arrest the Wobblies. Well, they would in Spokane arrest a Wobbly organizer, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, for breaking this ordinance. And so the IWW sent in large numbers of people into Spokane, just endless people that they brought in from all over the country, who would then stand and talk on corners, give speeches, so that they would be arrested. And over 500 people went to jail as a result of this, and 4 Wobblies were killed in the process. But it overwhelmed Spokane, the Spokane Police Department, and their jails. They could not handle arresting this many people, and they gave up and allowed street meetings again. By 1912, the organization had grown to about 50,000 members, actual members of the IWW, the main branch. They would be involved in over 150 strikes during this period, all across the United States, mostly in the western United States, but all over. The IWW was extremely active in Idaho. They also formed offshoot organizations that are separate from the main 50,000 members. So they formed the Agricultural Workers Organization, the AWO, which organized hundreds of thousands of migrant farm workers, to give them a voice. They also organized lumber workers, both in lumberjacks cutting the timber down and working in the sawmills, into the Lumber Workers Industrial Union. And the IWW lumber strike of 1917, which was pushing for better wages and hours, would lead to the 8-hour day in the United States. This strike started the movement going even stronger. This has been something that workers have been asking for quite a while. This really pushed it over the edge, and in the timber industry, they started giving workers an 8-hour day. Anything over 8 hours was considered overtime pay. This then started to spread to other industries, and then eventually Congress would pass laws saying that there was an 8-hour workday. The IWW also had a presence among waterfront workers, in Boston, New York City, New Orleans, Houston, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Eureka, Portland, Tacoma, Seattle, and Vancouver. Vancouver, Washington. They would organize these waterfront workers working on docks, handling shipment, and so they were starting to organize these groups as well. Now, the government used World War I as an opportunity to crush the IWW, because the IWW came out as anti-war. They were against the United States entry into the war, so then they started calling them seditious and arresting them for sedition. They started arresting them as German sympathizers, which they were not. But the idea was that they wanted to get rid of the IWW, and this is a way to break their power, because the war fever in the United States was quite strong, and so free speech was interrupted during this period. Now, one of the bigger strikes that the IWW helped in that led to a massive deportation was on July 12, 1917, 1,000 miners striked in Bisbee, Arizona against the Phelps Dodge Copper Company, and because of horrible conditions and toxins and everything else. And so they were on strike. Well, they lived in company towns, meaning the company owned the town that they lived in. So the miners striked. The government helped with the company, and they basically rounded up 1,000 striking miners and threw them out of the state of Arizona and made it illegal for them to come back into Arizona. The state did. This then, of course, left their families behind. Their families could no longer live in the company towns, and so then they had to move too. And they basically expelled the IWW from Arizona. Now, in September 1917, the U.S. Department of Justice would raid 48 IWW meeting halls in order to shut them down as being seditious and un-American. So in 1917, 166 leaders of the IWW in various areas would be arrested. 101 went on trial. This would include Big Bill Haywood, who was arrested as well. All of them were convicted to various degrees from various charges and sentenced to prison anywhere from 6 months to a year all the way up to 20 years in prison, depending on what the charge was. This really broke the back of the IWW. Now Haywood, who was arrested as part of all of this. He was released on bail. He realized that he was going to be convicted, that there was no doubt about it, that the court was against him. And so he would then flee the country. Haywood had become more and more socialist and then started becoming Marxist in his beliefs. And he would flee to the Soviet Union, where he lived until his death. Because by this point, in 1917, you would have the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union would form. And then there was an argument then as anti-communism rose in the United States that the IWW were communist. Now some were communists, some were socialists, some were other philosophies, because they were all a mix, but they were all labeled as communists. By 1930, the membership was down to about 10,000 people that were still IWW members, but the unions didn't have the clout that it used to have. Now, another union that would be formed right at the end of the 19th century would be the United Mine Workers Union, and this became a very powerful union as well in the United States. And it would be founded by this man, John L. Lewis. Now, Lewis and 8 others then would form within the AFL the Committee for Industrial Organizations of the CIO in 1935. So he started the United Mine Workers, but then he branched out into this Industrial Organizations Union as a part of the AFL. In November 38, the name was changed to the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO still, after being thrown out of the AFL because they campaigned on unskilled workers being part of it, African American workers, immigrant workers, and the AFL didn't want any of this stuff, so they would be thrown out. Now later, the CIO would join the AFL again in the late 20th century, and so today it is the AFL-CIO as the two unions are combined, but during this period they became separate. Now, the United Mine Workers were part of the CIO because this was a whole bunch of different unions that were combined together. And the United Mine Workers would attempt to organize Colorado miners in 1913. And so this is before all of the other CIO stuff fell apart. And I want to talk about the United Mine Workers a little bit. And so this provoked a harsh response from the Rockefeller family again, which controlled Colorado Fuel and Iron. So they were the main ones that these these miners were being organized from. So they worked for Colorado Fuel and Iron, and the Rockefellers did not like union organizing. Now the companies own the towns again. So these are company towns where they own everything in them. And so when these miners would go on strike, they would kick them out of their homes. So they would evict them. The strikers then set about to organize tent cities, and they set up 2 or 3 tent cities, and since they were kicked out of their homes, and they carried on their strike. The hope was that if they were kicked out of their homes, they'd end their strike, go back to work, so that they could have their homes back. The company would hire the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency in order to harass strikers and union organizers and try to break this strike. And so they would harass them, they would beat them, they would jump them at night, and several strikers would be killed. Now, on October 17th, the Baldwin Felts agents would use an armored car with a machine gun on it to attack the tent colony at Forbes, Colorado. And so they would open fire on the tent city, trying to drive the miners out. One miner was killed, a young boy was shot in the face, and a young girl was shot in the face, and a young boy was hit in the legs by 9 machine gun bullets from the armored car gun. Now, this caused the strikers to be even angrier than they were before, and they were striking more and picketing more. And so on October 28th, Colorado Governor Elias M. Emmons would call out the National Guard. Now, after months of stalemate, so the National Guard was there to keep the peace, but nothing was progressing, and Governor Emmons was spending a fortune to keep the Colorado National Guard in the field, so he decided to send the regular National Guard home, and he accepted an offer by the coal companies in Colorado, the Rockefeller companies, to put their men into National Guard uniforms, meaning the detective agency men. And so they would be called National Guard, but they were really not National Guard. They're just private detectives, these private security companies. And this would be formed into Company B of the Colorado National Guard. And so Company B mainly meaning a fake National Guard unit. They were wearing the uniforms, but they were not really National Guard. And here are a few of them here. And so what happens on April 20th is what's known as the Ludlow Massacre. So the Ludlow Tent Village was one of the larger of the tent villages for the striking miners, and the troops, who weren't really troops, this Company B, were ordered to remove them from the tent village, and so they opened fire on Ludlow. And so they started shooting into the tent village, trying to drive the miners out, and it turned into a pitched gun battle. The miners were driven from the camp, and this militia, the National Guard, fake National Guard, would set fire to the camp to destroy everything there. This way they could get rid of this strike. 2 women and 11 children who had been hiding in a pit beneath one tent to dodge the bullets that were flying everywhere could not get out in time and burned to death. On top of that, fire victims, another 13 people were killed. Of miners that were killed in the village, and the photo you see here is of the tent village, or what's left of it afterwards. And this becomes known as the Ludlow Massacre. Now, the governor was shocked by this, pulled those guys out of uniform, but no punishment for their actions was ever happened to them. Now, let's leave mining behind and move to another issue in labor that really galvanized people to make changes. And this would be the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire in March of 1911. And so here's the Triangle Shirtwaist building. And shirtwaists are a piece of male clothing that women workers sew. And the company employed about 500 women in this building, mostly Jewish immigrants, between the ages of 13 and 23. And these women would sit in there and sew these shirtwaists. Well, they would take breaks, and to take breaks, they would go from the upper stories where they worked all the way down out to the street, get a little fresh air, take a little break. Well, the company decided this was taking too long, that's going up and down. So they ended up chaining the women into the areas where they were working, chaining all the doors so that they could not get out, so that way they wouldn't waste time on their breaks. Well, a fire broke out a couple floors down through some oily rags, and so all of these women were trapped in the top floors of this building. And here you see the fire department trying to put it out. One of the big problems was the building was extremely tall. We're starting to move into taller and taller buildings, what would eventually become skyscrapers, even though this really isn't one. But fire departments did not have ladders or water pressure or hoses to get that high yet. The fire departments had not caught up with the buildings that were going up so quickly. The end result was that these women were trapped. Many jumped out of the windows to escape the flames, falling to their deaths, and 146 women died in less than 15 minutes. And this is a scene of the bodies lying on the street of these women. And so people were outraged at these conditions, what was going on. Of course, actually no charges ended up sticking. The company individuals who did this were acquitted or never went to trial. But everybody's angry about this gap and the treatment of the workers and the poor conditions and the poor pay, and that certain individuals are getting wealthier and wealthier. All right, that moves us into the 1920s and the end of the 1920s in particular. And so as we move into the later 1920s, there is a very unequal distribution of wealth. There were, during the 20s, massive tax cuts for the high income earners, the belief being that if you give tax breaks to the wealthy and the big corporations, that it will all trickle down. And it wasn't Ronald Reagan that invented this style of economics, trickle-down economics. This was happening in the 20s. And so they got cuts, but wages were not going up. And so from 1923 to 1929, corporate profits went up 65%, but workers' wages only went up 8%. So the companies were making more and more, but the workers were not seeing that benefit. Many people had little extra money to spend, so credit became the new way to buy, but then it's hard to pay your credit bills. Farm prices started dropping drastically in the 1920s in the southern United States and the western United States. And so farmers, especially small farmers, were having a hard time. They were losing their farms. They could not support themselves. And it started being that it cost more to plant the crops and harvest them than what you could sell them for. And so they went deeper and deeper into debt. There were lots of international problems, and the European economies were not doing so well, which meant our exports were down. We were not selling that much overseas. All of this stuff was starting to build up. So people started to invest in the rising stock market, this new thing, on what's called margin, meaning on credit. You don't have the money to invest in the stock market, so you do it on credit, and then when your stocks do well, you make lots of money, you can then pay off your debt. By 1929, confidence that prices would keep rising forever faltered, then failed. And once this confidence failed, the stock market starts going down. And on October 29th, in the worst day of the stock panic, stocks lost somewhere between $10 billion to $15 billion in value. So basically the bottom fell out. By mid-November of 1929, almost all the gains of the previous 2 years before this had been wiped out, and the losses were estimated at about $30 billion. This, of course, was the great stock market crash leading to the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression was a worldwide depression because we do have an interlocking global economy. However, the United States was one of the countries hit hardest. And so from 1929 to 1933, things continued to get worse. And there are some clips on the Great Depression and that you can take a look at that covers some of this stuff. Hundreds of factories and mills closed. Unemployment went from 3.2% to 24.9%, leaving more than 15 million people out of work. Some would remain unemployed for years. And so these are people trying to get jobs, any job that's possible because there aren't enough jobs. And those that had jobs faced major wage cuts, and many people could only find part-time work. By 1932, then, also because of this, more than 9,000 banks in the United States failed, and there is no such thing as bank insurance during this period. So if your bank closes, all money you have in that bank ceases to exist. You do not get it back. It's gone forever. So your life savings are wiped out. And this would be 40% of the total, national total of banks. So 40% of the banks in the United States closed their doors not to reopen. And as I said, it wiped out the savings of millions of people. Lots of people then couldn't pay their bills. They would lose their homes, and homeless people built shacks out of old crates and formed shanty towns. You just basically these homeless villages, which they started calling Hoovervilles after President Hoover, who was president at the time of the crash. Now, an ironic thing about this is that Hoover did not, while as president, did not contribute to causing the Great Depression. These practices had been building up for a while. However, he was the Secretary of Commerce under President Harding and President Coolidge, and his practices would lead to what would become the Great Depression, some of the decisions he made in that position. And so when he became president, the crash was there. It happened, but not because of what he did as president, but what he did before. And so here's a Hoovertown, or Hooverville, as it's known. And so President Herbert Hoover refused to provide any government aid to the unemployed. He did not believe in it. He said there would be no government aid, no government support, no anything, because he was a very pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of guy. And he believed that if you gave any kind of government help, subsidies, welfare of any kind, then people would never work for themselves. They would be lazy for the rest of their lives and never do anything. And so no help at all. And that local groups, that the states could do it, or local groups, churches, they could provide the help. The thing was, though, is money was so scarce and everybody was hit so hard that there was nobody at the local level that had enough resources to help. And only the federal government seemed to have that, and he refused to use it. And so here's a soup line at a mission, and the idea was that local missions, churches would provide the food to people who had no food. And so this is a Dorothea Lange photo of the woman in the Great Depression. It's a famous one. And of course, on top of all of this, the area of the Great Plains gets hit with a massive drought. This turns into the Dust Bowl, finishing off what farmers hadn't already been damaged by everything else. And conditions just continue to get worse in the United States. And so there's a huge gap, even larger gap than before, between rich and poor. And that's where we come to Franklin Roosevelt. And he is elected president in 1932. And he won a decisive victory. And the Democrats also swept the congressional elections and captured more seats in the House and Senate. And the whole plan here was that he campaigned on what he called a New Deal for America. And by 1932, Americans had hit rock bottom. I mean, they were going down fast. Things were horrible. And they wanted a miracle. And so they voted for Roosevelt to pull them out of this depression. And he said he would do this with the New Deal. And so one of the first things he did when he became president was he declared a bank holiday in 1933. He closed all the banks in the United States that day, and then they would be audited. And if federal reviewers certified that they were solvent and stable, then they would reopen their doors. If they were not solvent and stable, they would stay closed until they would be able to do that. The idea being that this would end runs on the bank collapse, these types of things, which had hit record numbers already and was causing an immense amount of trouble. He abandoned the gold standard in 1933, which put more money into circulation to create a mild inflation, the idea being to try to jumpstart the economy. And this was the whole premise of the New Deal. And you have some, on your video clip, you have a little bit of stuff on the New Deal. The idea was that if you pour more money into the economy, more government money into the economy, to get the economy jump-started, it would then take off on its own. He formed a lot of other things as part of his New Deal program. And one of these would be the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and would employ young adults to perform unskilled work. So all of these young men who were out of work, had no work and had no prospects, the government put them to work. They sent them and gave them military-style training, but for work. They lived in barracks, and they got a paycheck. And then a government paycheck. And part of that paycheck or in fact, the majority of it actually went to their home to support their families. So either their parents, if they were married, their wife and children, this kind of idea. And so that way that they got a little bit of money then in their pocket, but the rest went to support their family. This put money in people's hands. They would go out and buy food. They'd go out and buy things, that necessities they needed, which then started stimulating small businesses. And here are some CCC workers here. All across the United States, tens of thousands of workers. He created the Tennessee Valley Authority in 1933, and then later the Columbia Valley Authority, which built a series of dams on the Tennessee River back east, dams on the Columbia out west. The idea being, one, it provides a lot of jobs to build these dams, but also it provides electricity and brings electricity to rural areas. Is working on better navigation, all these types of things. He created FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which provided bread lines and other aid to the unemployed so that they would have necessities and food, so government soup kitchens, this kind of thing, so that people could be able to eat until they were able to find a job. He created the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which paid farmers not to grow crops. The idea being that you wanted to cause slight shortages and not a glut in the market so that farm prices would go up. Farmers then could start making a living and you get everything rolling again. The National Recovery Act created fair standards in favor of labor unions. He was very pro-labor. The Civil Works Administration provided temporary jobs for millions of unemployed people, and so this would be replaced later by the Public Works Administration, which is longer term, but the idea was to put everybody to work. And so the Public Works Administration would provide skilled workers. And so unskilled, skilled workers, everybody goes to work. So they hired every job imaginable and put you on the government payroll. They hired artists to paint and sculpt. They hired actors to act, writers to write, the whole works. Any kind of job that you had out there, they hired you to do it so that you could have a paycheck, which therefore then stimulated the economy. Created the FDIC, which insures deposits in banks, which we still have up to, believe it's up to $250,000 now. So if a bank closes and you lose your money, the government pays you back. This is government insurance. The Securities Act of 1933 created the Securities Exchange Commission. It set standards for the sale and purchase of stock, that risks had to be adequately disclosed. The idea would be to keep what happened with the stock market crash from happening again. Of course, many of these things would be rescinded later, which caused the economic recession in 2008. He also really worked hard on the Indian Reorganization Act in 1935, what was known as the Indian New Deal. This would try to provide more jobs and training on Native American reservations around the country that were in abject poverty, and so they started trying to work to improve those conditions. His administration created the Social Security Act in 1935, which created Social Security. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, took the place of those earlier temporary ones of putting everybody possible to work. The National Labor Relations Act granted the right of labor unions to exist, that workers could unionize. He was very pro-labor. The Fair Labor Standards Act established a maximum normal work week of 40 hours a week. So you had an 8-hour day, 40-hour work week, which is we still have today. And he created the first minimum wage of 40 cents per hour. And so all of these programs and many others were to help people try to close the income gap, get the Great Depression over with, and stimulate capitalism again. And it worked. And so basically everything hit kind of rock bottom. Roosevelt and the New Deal stopped its decline, leveled it out, and then slowly started raising it. And it was working, and it was working quite well. It was taking much longer than he thought it would take, but it was working. And then World War II came along and instantly pulled us out of the Great Depression. Now, we would have come out of the Great Depression anyway, but it would have been 1940, maybe 41, before we were back to normal levels. But the war came along, it pulled us out immediately because of helping Europe, and this stimulated our economy. And then, of course, once we entered the war, it stimulated our economy again. And so this will end this module's lecture. And in the next module, we'll start moving from after World War II up to the present and what was going on with income inequality during this period.